we go. Well, tonight we're going to be talking a little bit about a subject that is a little bit difficult. We're going to be talking about, hey guys, if you can get the camera. We're going to be talking a little bit about the Holocaust. This week, in fact, was the Remembrance Day of that. It's the 76th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And so we are going to talk about some sensitive subjects tonight. If you have small children, if you have children that might be upset, if you have adults that might be upset by some of the images. And I will just tell you that I purposely didn't include a lot of those images. There are a few, but even so, they can be difficult to look at. So if you have a sensitive nature, which is very reasonable, if you have children, please know that this might be one to screen first and then see whether or not that would be appropriate for them. So one of the things we skipped over this evening was our prayer, and I purposely delayed it to this time. It seems apropos to lift that up as we enter into this material. So Father God, we thank you so much for the blessings that you have provided us. Father, this world can be a difficult world. The heart of man is despicably evil, and his hatred for his fellow man has known and shown no bounds. Father, your people are a people that you love and a people that you call by your name, and that has placed them in the spotlight, that the world would turn, and because they hate you, they have hated them. Father, Yeshua warned us that this would be true of us as well, that the times would come when, because the world first hated him, it will hate us and seek to do us harm. So Father, we thank you that no matter what happens in this world, we have one that can return our life to us. We have one who loves us, who loved us from before the time frame that the earth was formed, knew us intimately, and we are thankful for that. For if there is no God and if there is no justice, then truly this world is a despicable and a difficult and a horrible place to be. But it is the light of Yeshua that shines, Father, that makes a light in this dark world. And so we thank you for that. We lift all these things up in the holy name of Yeshua HaMashiach. Amen. All righty. So the title that I have is Observing the Holocaust Yesterday and Today. And there in the center is that phrase in German that was placed over the top of the entryway into Auschwitz. And it's Arbeit macht frei. Work will make you free. Of course, that wasn't true. There was not going to be anybody who would be made free through their works in that camp. The only freedom that would come would be when the Soviet troops showed up to rescue those that had been interred there. And by that time, in excess of 1.1 million people had been channeled through this camp, which was purposely designed in order to exterminate people in the most quick way and efficient way that they could. Now, George Bernard Shaw is the poet who is credited with conceptualizing what would be needed. He was a progressive, and he felt that everybody should have to come before the committee and rationalize why it is that they should still be allowed to live and how they were a net benefit to society. And if they were not, then he postulated that there should be some easy and humane way to take their lives. And the gas chambers was conceptual. He's picked that up and ran with it, and in no form was it humane. So January 27th, 1945, 76 years ago this week, the Soviet troops came into the area of Auschwitz and were able to liberate the remaining people that were there. When they entered into the camp, they found hundreds of thousands of clothing outfits for males, hundreds of thousands of outfits for females. They found glasses, they found hair. It's just amazing what had been done to these people, all in the name of reclaiming their resources as they were being shuttled into the gas chambers to meet their end. And of course, there were a number of those that were not parted into the gas chambers. When these people arrived by rail cars, those that had survived the trip, and they were packed in such a way that surviving the trip was not a foregone conclusion. There was standing room only. And when the cars were opened, there was a SS soldier who stood on a podium, on a stand, and decided as he looked at people right or left. And depending on which way he sent you, you either went to the gas chambers immediately, or you were sent into the portion of the camp into which you would be worked to death. And the camp was geared towards producing munitions and gunpowder, as many of these camps were, and we tend to think of the concentration camps as these large complexes into which the Jews and other peoples that were deemed to be less than desirable, the despicables of their days, those people were channeled into these few facilities. But the reality is that there were in excess of 10,000 work camps that were set up across the Third Reich. And they were set up specifically to take the slave labor of these people and to work them to death. There were places like Auschwitz and others that were specifically designed to also exterminate people in a efficient and quick manner. But we shouldn't move past the fact that people were being used as slave labor in addition to being killed. Well, how do we end up there, right? It's a natural question to ask. When you look at the history of Europe, what you see is predominantly monarchies. And when we come through the Middle Ages, we get this rise of this class of people that are merchants and tradespeople, and these people start accumulating wealth. And so whereas the monarchies held all the power, and initially they were the ones that controlled both the wealth and the resources of people, resources of materials, resources of equipment, eventually you have the rise of parliamentary rule, right? England's probably the greatest example of that, but even across Germany and across the rest of Europe, you have this move towards a democratic style of governance that is either just under the monarchy, but still subjected to the monarchy, or eventually flipped to where it sits over the monarchy itself. As that progresses, and we have the great experiment that is the United States, and the way in which the United States threw off the yoke of King George III, 10 years later, you get the French Revolution. And the French Revolution, unfortunately, was decoupled from God. And it decoupled itself both from the morality of God as well as from the monarchy, leaving nothing to restrain man and setting the stage really for what will occur across Europe for the next 200 years or so. So the Red Terror, which initially starts out pointed at the monarchy but expands out to include all the people with whom one might have an argument, and one might be able to cajole democratically their fellow citizens to bring them to the guillotine and take their lives. In the mid-1800s, a little more than 50 years later, you have the rise of the writings of Karl Marx, who posits an idea of conflict theory. And here he identifies that it's groups against groups. And the group that he recognizes is the group that doesn't have and those that have. And so he starts postulating what will eventually be the Communist Manifesto. And that too will set the stage for the burning of Europe in ways that people could rarely have imagined. So again, the problem was, how do you control all of these people? The people who are in control are always a small minority. And the problem is that there's a different small minority that wants to usurp that power, to take that power, and will do so by force wherever necessary. Well, we have the same concepts arising today. We have people who have no idea why there should be any concern about a socialist government, and why that would not be any better or any worse than any other form of government that we could have. So let's take a look at this, and if you guys would, just go ahead and stay with the slide for the moment. We're going to contrast equity of outcome. They keep talking about equity nowadays, and we're going to compare that to equality of opportunity. And really, it's not a semantic argument that we're concerned about. The argument that we're concerned about here is where the rubber meets the road. What is the true differences between these two systems? Because we are in the process of trying to completely usurp the system of equality of opportunity and replace it with equity of outcome. All right. So for equity of outcome, it will require a dictatorial judge, a jury, and an executive. You might even replace that with an executioner. Somebody has to be in charge of deciding who doesn't have and who should have and who should give up, and somebody must have not only the ability to judge these things, but to adjudicate these things and to execute those concepts. On the other hand, when you're talking about equality of opportunity, here the power allows for a dynamic structure, and it's a temporary control of power. Remember that what we have today are politicians who have decided that that's going to be their life work. What we were supposed to have were people, farmers, business people who were seeing to the needs of their community, that for a season of service, they would volunteer to go, and if elected, be raised to the Senate for 6 years, then come home and return to their lives. They were in the House of Representatives 2 years and return home to their lives. It was always supposed to be dynamic and a temporary control of power. And the problem is that when you move away from that, you naturally slide into this desire of man to control other men. And it requires time in the saddle, so to speak. Well, for equity of outcome, there has to be ownership or control of the means of production by the people in power. Now, this has taken different forms in different settings. In the Soviet Union, everything was owned by the state, and so be it the labor, be it the natural resources, be it the machinery, everything was owned by the state. When we look at socialism, particularly when we look at the types of socialism that rose against that which was the communists of the Soviet Union, what you find is that you have this conglomeration of state-owned and state-controlled corporations. And these corporations do the bidding of the state if they are not owned outright by the state. And their continued existence for the individuals that own them is allowed by the state only as long as the state decides that it is helpful to them. In the case of equality of opportunity, you have private and disseminated ownership. There's not supposed to be one individual that ends up having a monopoly. The expectation is that people can freely enter into trade, people can freely decide to start up manufacturing, and the concept of a oligarchy or a group of people that form a cartel, or worse yet, those that will concentrate all of the resources and all of the manufacturing into one group, a robber baron, as we used to call them, was foreign to the people who formed our country. And again, all of these are disseminated. And so there's no control that any one individual is supposed to have, or any one group of individuals. We have, in the case of equity of outcome, you have rigid control of information. Whereas in an equality of opportunity, there should be freedom from control of information. Now that comes with a dual-edged sword. That means that there can be false narratives that are proffered, and you're going to have to deal with the fact that people can say some of the most horrendous things about each other. You can look not just at the last election cycle and the last few election cycles, but go back into the 1800s and look about how the individuals and the people that were supporting those individuals for president talked about each other. There were some pretty obnoxious and rude and nasty things that were being said. You have, in the case of equity of outcome, you have the fact that it is freedom incompatible. Think about that, right? If you are going to seek to restructure society so that there is equity of outcome, somebody has to be in charge, and naturally freedoms have to go away. You cannot have freedoms existing and somebody in charge who decides you get, but you do not. In the case of equality of opportunity, freedom is inherent. And here you have to recognize that just like there is a bell curve of people with aptitudes, capabilities, and desires, and the interplay between all of those various traits, it also means that there will be a distribution of outcomes. That two individuals that may have the same desire to start the same business, one may prosper and one may not. But there will be the opportunity equal to both of them to navigate that as they see fit. There won't be a state that decides, well, we need petroleum engineers, and so at the age of 5, they're going to identify those that have ability in mathematics at that age and put them into a program so that they will be a petroleum engineer when they get older, because that's what the state is forcing them to become, without any questions as to what they want to do. With the equity of outcome, you have governments that allows liberties to the degree that they are useful to the controlling authorities. Right? People who buy into this system will tell you it's a living constitution. We need to have something that's not so rigid, something that we can change willy-nilly when we feel like we need to. And they look at the fact that the Constitution, though living, does not allow for as quick of changes as a mob may desire. And it's that way specifically to safeguard and to give people time to breathe and think. Because as we're going to see in a few minutes, when given the opportunity and the circumstances, freedoms can evaporate in the blink of an eye or the stroke of a pen. In the case of equality of opportunity, liberties are inherent, right? We wrote it into the Declaration of Independence that these liberties, that these things were given by God, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? No government has the right to remove those from you in this system of thought. But in the other, liberties are only what the government decides to give to you. And again, people who like that will tell you, they'll try to tell you, since they don't believe that there's a God, that it's only governments that give you liberties and freedoms. And if you are going to get them, you're going to get them from the government. Well, not according to the unique experiment that is the United States. You have, in the case of equity of outcome, Lenin talked about the useful idiots. Marx talked about religion as though it was the opiate of the masses. But the reality is that if you are going to control a large group of people, you need some way to control them. And in the case of these progressive mindsets where they seek to induce equity of outcome, it's through the sedation of the individuals. They do it today through entertainment and through education, through training them up from an early age in how they should understand the world. Worldview is probably one of the most important things that there is. And if you eliminate God out of the worldview, you eliminate God out of the moralities, you eliminate things like freedoms and liberties coming from anywhere but from the government. They do it by inducing poverty. They may give equity of outcome for everybody else, but not for themselves. But that outcome is going to be one of poverty. He who worries about making ends meet and taking care of his family does not have time to worry about overthrowing a government. And that was effective in the Soviet Union, as well as the Eastern Bloc, as well as China. And again, they will create a set of circumstances by which those that they favor will get liberties to enjoy services, and those that they don't favor won't get access to them. All right? We currently have in China a system in place of social credits. Now they can keep track of the individual. Before, your mind was your own, and what you thought and who you talked to, people you talk to might snitch. But now they have cameras everywhere. They can see who you're associating with. They can see where you're traveling. They can monitor your internet, your phone. All of your communications are being now governed, recorded, and sifted to see who has the social credits to allow them to have things like jobs, to allow them to have things like access to public transportation or the ability to travel at all. Access to food is tied to your social credits. And our Democratic friends feel that that's a great system, that we need to implement it here in the United States, because they see a system by which, again, they can control. It's equity of outcome versus the concept of equality of opportunity. In the case of equality of opportunity, here the stimulation of the masses is the goal, right? The sky's the limit. We want everybody to reach as high as they can reach, past where some of us thought they might be able to reach. But here in this system, be it in entertainment, be it in engineering, be it wherever, we are looking truly for people to be able to rise up through their freedoms, to make the choices, to do the things that they want to do, and to do them to the very best of their abilities. Innovation under that mindset is encouraged. Risk-taking is encouraged. Well, thinking about starting a business. But what if I fail? Right? Those are the opportunities that you have the freedom to choose, as opposed to being told at age 5 that you will be a petroleum engineer. And that's what you're going to be, no matter how much you like it or dislike it. So let's talk a little bit about that timeline of the Nazi rise to power. Because we've talked about the late 1700s with the United States forming, with the revolution that occurs in 1776, the French Revolution that literally is a revolution of the mind of man, has no desire, no interest, in fact has a great hatred for God. Remember that at the time of the French Revolution, they took the pigs and the horses, they turned out all the pews in the churches, and they shuttled in the livestock to poop and pee within the churches because they had such a hatred for God and for church. And of course, that hatred of man ends up being worked out in the guillotine. Well, 1914 to 1917, we have World War I. That 1800 period, we have the Napoleonic Wars. We have lots of conflicts between groups in Europe, because in this time frame, you still have an outward turning of those countries. They are turning outwards to see about claiming resources that other countries have, and there's just fighting between them. And you end up in 1914 with the beginning of World War I, which ends up being a war that just grinds people to death. If you haven't seen 1917, I encourage you to look at it. It's a tough movie to watch. Germany, of course, loses the war, and they are forced to pay reparations. Reparations that are so very onerous that they are struggling to do so when times are good. And times are pretty good in the 1920s. However, their government, they're struggling somewhat. And they're able for many years to put together a government that holds together. Their structure of government is they had an equivalent of a parliament, the Reichstag. They had a chancellor who was in charge of that, and then they had somebody over the chancellor in the form of a man by the name of Hindenburg. And he basically had the role of kind of final say in what he was going to allow and what he wouldn't allow. And periodically, he would allow for them to use Article number 48. Article 48 said that the chancellor could rule by decree, that they did not have to pass laws. And it was set up specifically for times of emergency so that one could have a very timely response to something that has happened that's threatening the country. And between 1925 and 1930, it was used a total of 16 times. However, you have the stock market crash of 1929. And with that, the onset of the Great Depression. Now large numbers of people across the world are out of work and struggling to feed their families. And the Bolshevik Revolution that took the Soviet Union, or took Russia, which becomes the Soviet Union, is now lighting up the rest of Europe as they are fomenting violence because the people are easy to manipulate at this point. 1931, the German government is exceedingly unstable. They have several elections, and Article 48 is used in that year 42 times. But wait, it gets worse. 1932, again, the government's still unstable, 3 times for elections. And Article 48 is now used 58 times within that year-long period. And that brings us up to January of 1933, when Hindenburg hands to Hitler the chancellorship, thinking that he can probably control Hitler, and knowing that they needed somebody who had some strength to try to get a government that would be functional. Well, February 27th, 1933, we have the Reichstag fire. And I talked about this last week. For years and years and years, it was said that it was the communists. And nobody could figure out how such a conflagration could occur in so little time, because it appeared that fires had been set in multiple places, so many places that one person would not have been able to accomplish that. Subsequently, we know that, or it's conjectured still, it hasn't been proven, but the pieces are falling into place, that the communists were brought in to take the fall, but it was the Nazis themselves who actually started the fire. Again, not proved, but everything points in that direction. So that's February 27th. Chancellor Hitler comes to power on January 30th with the expectation that in early March they are going to have an election. So he uses this opportunity, and the very next day, February 28th, 1933, he has the Reichstag decree. And this abolished most civil liberties in Germany. This allowed him to round up the communists. This allowed him to round up the communist leaders, the people who had been duly elected by the people, so that he could sequester them off so that they could not participate in votes that would come up. And the people themselves were impeded from actually voting for the parties that they desired. The election, on March 3rd, 1933, the very first concentration camp is set up. And this concentration camp is set up inside of a school. And they're using the school grounds because they can control it. And at this point, it's just for political prisoners. Again, they're rounding up the communists. With the election 2 days away, they want to make sure that they can control the outcome of the election. March 5th, the German election, and that consolidates Hitler's power. He's been able to move the communists to a place to where they're not going to be able to vote sufficiently. He's moved the people who were duly elected as communists out so that they can't vote in the Reichstag, and that gives him control that he needs in order to start running the country. March 22nd, Dachau is opened up on the outskirts of Munich, again set up predominantly initially to house political prisoners and anybody that the political party of the Nazis felt might be a danger to them or might compensate their ability to consolidate power. March 23rd, they passed this law to remedy the distress of the people and the Reich, the country. And that law then allowed them to start clamping down more and more on those people that were deemed to be unacceptable to them. And there's a long list of those that meet that criteria. But at the top of that list were the Jews. So why was it that Hitler rose to power? Right? It all comes down to the instilling into Europe of this concept of conflict theory that Karl Marx brings about. Right? The rise of communism now gives voice, but it gives voice to the masses of people against the tiny minority of people that are ruling. And unfortunately, though the bill of goods that the masses were sold was that this was for their benefit and it would all be rainbows and unicorns once they took power, there has yet to be a communist regime for whom that has been true. Remember that in the last 100 years, from 1900 to the last day of 1999, progressive communist socialistic governments killed in excess of 100 million, possibly as high as 200 million, of their own citizens outside of warfare because those people were deemed as people they needed to get rid of. That's a huge number. The higher number represents almost 4 people per minute for every single minute of every single hour of every single day of the last century. The lower one's about 2. So you had this old money and power, and you had all these new technologies that were coming up. I mean, think about it. The 20s and the 30s, we have radio, we have automobiles, we have airplanes. We have all of these technologies that never existed before, and you have this conglomeration of people who were the old power brokers and old wealth, and those that are making their wealth in the new technologies. Think the dot-coms of the 90s. Think Facebook. Think Google. Think Twitter. All of these groups who now are coming together and partnering with the ones that have power in order to control things. So again, the conservative elite were the old ruling class, and you had this new business class in the Weimar Germany. Throughout the 20s, they became increasingly frustrated with the Weimar Republic's continuing economic and political instability. There was strike after strike after strike. Why? Because the communists controlled the people, and they could motivate them to strike as a way to destabilize the country. So economic and political instability, their lack of real power, and the rise of communism was really what they were fighting. They believed that a return to an authoritarian rule was the only stable future for Germany, which would protect their power and their money. Okay? So, in the midst of that, you have Hitler, who arises in the early 20s, shortly after the war, and he partners with the socialists. And the socialists are partnering with him, again, because he needs control of the masses, as do the communists, in order to effectively control and wrest power from those people who have had it. Now, in the case of the communists and the Nazis, you can see immediately why they hated each other, right? Somebody was going to get the power here, and somebody wasn't. And whoever wasn't was going to be killed off. And so what you have is this partnership that occurs between the Nazis and the old wealth structure and the old power structure and the new wealth and the new power structure, just as we see it today, where government comes hand in hand, and it gets to be this revolving door, where the people from the government are the people from the industry. And the Nazis as a state owned many of the industries, but they didn't own all of them, and they decided who would keep their ownership on things and who wouldn't. But for the most part, it was a state-owned operation, or at least state-controlled, because the government told you what you could do, what you could buy, what you could make. And the communists get rounded up and killed off as part of those non-desirables. Well, this is an aerial picture of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And in 1940, in April of 1940, they cleared out 40 square kilometers and leveled it all to the ground. They removed houses that were there, they removed factories that were there, they stretched it all out and scraped the ground clean in order to create this purpose-built concentration camp that had the primary goal of being an efficient way to kill off people that the Germans, Nazis, did not care for. And they were quite good at it. Auschwitz and Birkenau had 3 real goals. One, to incarcerate real and perceived enemies of the Nazi regime and the German occupation authorities in Poland for an indefinite period. They also wanted to supply forced laborers for deployment in SS-owned construction-related enterprises and later armaments and other war-related productions. Remember that across Europe, they were building like there was no tomorrow. You look at the seawall that was built in and the fortifications that were made along the Atlantic, or the forts that were put in. They were constructing literally fortresses that would allow their submarines to come in without being picked off from the air, and then no matter how much we bombed that concrete structure, it was designed to deflect out and dissipate the shock waves so that everybody inside was still able to continue their work safely, and to protect the people and the machines within it as well. So there was a huge amount of construction that was occurring, but later there's a need for war materials, and so they're using the slave labor for that as well. To some degree, in some places, like where they were making the V-2 and the V-1 rockets, those individuals sabotaged those devices, and they tried to do what they could do to make sure that though they were being worked to death literally, that they could do their part to save as many lives as they could by sabotaging the work. They also were to serve as a site to kill. Initially, it was small targeted groups of the population whose death was determined by the SS and police authorities to be essential to the security of Nazi Germany. And it's that takes off. It grows from the targeting of small groups to targeting large numbers of people. This map with all the dots all over it, and recognize that this is Germany and Poland and parts of Russia. Each of these dots represents one of the major, larger concentration camps. Not all the concentration camps were set up to exterminate people, but as they have looked more and more closely, and the Germans, like most people who end up doing very evil things and don't realize that it's evil, they were very good record keepers of exactly what they were doing to whom and where. And what we end up finding is that there was almost no community within Germany that didn't have a slave labor force, sometimes as small as 4 people, oftentimes somewhere between 12 and 20 in the smaller communities. But there was no place across Germany where they were not using these slave laborers. And then we have these larger camps that have thousands to tens of thousands that may, in the case of Auschwitz and others, have 1.1 million people die, and more than that come through the camp. Recognize that in the far right side of the slide you have Majdanek. That was the first camp that was liberated by the Soviets. That first liberation, and now they're starting to see what it is that the Germans have been doing, occurs in July of 1944. Reports had already been coming back, and pleads had been made with Truman to bomb the camps, to at least put the ovens out of commission, and they deemed that was not something that they were willing to do. The conditions that people lived under, the lack of food, the lack of hygiene, the lack of basic things such as heat. The buildings were constructed purposely to let the winds through in order to make the conditions that much harder on people. You had people who starved to death, you had people who froze to death, you had people that were worked to death. You had people that once their work output dropped, they were moved into the side of the camp in which they would be exterminated. And it was something that they oversaw with a great deal of zeal and merriment on the part of the Germans. When the Soviet soldiers came into that first concentration camp and started finding people, and these are actually pictures that came out of Auschwitz, people were incredulous to the inhumanity that had been done to people. The camps on the far eastern part of Europe, inside the Soviet Union, the far edge of Poland, those camps had atrocities that people could barely imagine. But when they got to Auschwitz and they found a camp that was literally designed to exterminate people, there was just a whole nother level of understanding of the inhumanity that our fellow man can do to others that they do not deem to be worthy of the equity that they speak of for all the others that they have as preferred groups. Not much equity there. Well, that brings us into a little discussion of what has occurred here in the early part of January here in the United States at the Capitol. Because there is a political party that is painting with a broad brush those that have voted for Trump. We have people making statements that people who voted for Trump or facilitated Trump, who worked in his administration, should be blacklisted and they should be rounded up, that their children should be rounded up and taken away from them, that they need to be reprogrammed, interesting choice of words, straight out of the Soviet Union, and that these people are not worthy of the equity that they are claiming for other people, right? There are people that are going to win, there are people that are going to lose, and they are looking to have people resign, or they're talking about openly voting to remove Republicans out of office. And I will just tell you, take people at their word when they say that they are going to do things. If they think they can get away with it, they absolutely will. Mein Kampf. Hitler told everybody what he planned to do. People just didn't believe it. Well, we have some interesting pictures that show up out of the Capitol. You've got this gentleman on the right-hand side who's got this Camp Auschwitz, work brings freedom, it says, right? The slogan that's there over top of the gates. You can see him in the middle picture at the top there. That's him again, same day. You have these individuals who were part of the QAnon group that had been, there were parts of that group that had been plotting the violence that they were going to perpetrate. And in fact, they started that before the speech that Trump gave had ended. We have the Proud Boys. And people are just nice and comfortable with the shirt on the left if you're a conservative, right? Because you have the communist hammer and sickle, you have the fist that is of socialism, which you don't see, which you probably ought to see on that shirt, should have been the Nazi symbol as well. However, there are significant numbers of these guys. Notice the slide on the right, right? 6MWE with the German eagle on the shirt. 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust was not enough. That's what the shirt says. I don't know about you, but I can tell you right now, if I was standing out somewhere and I saw a shirt as this, I would say something and I wouldn't stay, or I would try to get that individual to leave. Problem is that these people are inside of the groups that were supporting President Trump. There is some accuracy to that. Let's look at that a little bit further. You have this photographer, Lloyd Wolf, and interestingly, he's got an article where he's interviewed and he talks about how everybody there is white, and he specifically talks about the two women that were blowing the shofars, and he makes a point of saying that when he talked to them about sounding off some of the notes that we used during the high holy days, that they weren't aware of what he meant. And he doesn't spend a lot of time on that, but he does spend a lot of time on the fact that he saw pictures of people and was close to the guy that had the shirt on that had the Camp Auschwitz shirt. And interestingly, for a photographer who all of his pictures are digital and all of them are time and geographically stamped, he feigned ignorance when he was asked about the timing of these things, right? Because the timing does become important to the narrative as to whether Trump incited the riot or whether the riot was already going on while Trump was speaking, which turns out to be the timeline. Oh, by the way, he notes that normally he shows up everywhere he goes with the Black Lives Matters mask on his face, but he knew not to do that in this crowd. So his political leanings are such that that's where he lives. Well, we also have to talk about the Turner Diaries. And the Turner Diaries was first published in a little publication that was geared towards white supremacists. It was published chapter by chapter, and eventually it's published as a complete book under a pseudonym. And we find that the Turner Diaries and the prescription that it has for overthrowing the government in order to eliminate all people of color out of the United States first, and then the rest of the world, but specifically targeting the Jews, because the Jews are seen as those that are the ones pulling the strings behind the scenes. The same sorts of discussions in the book that lead to what we saw in the Middle Ages, having to do with the accusations of blood libels, that the Jews were going and taking children of Christians and sucking their blood and doing horrible rituals in order to worship Satan, right? Nothing could be further from the truth. But these things were used historically from the Middle Ages on and show up again in the Turner Diaries. Now, the Turner Diaries talks about putting together a bomb like the one Timothy McVeigh had. In fact, they found pages from the Turner Diary specific to that in his possession. And in the Turner Diary, it talks about making a bomb and blowing up an FBI facility, right? And that's what Timothy McVeigh did in Oklahoma City. In Charlottesville, and again, we have to be really, really clear. There's a minority of people who are bad actors who have shown up, and yes, they may support Trump, but they have reprehensible ideologies, and we hope that those ideologies go away over time. But the night that before the incident where the individual gets run over by the vehicle, they marched on this Confederate statue with tiki torches, very reminiscent of the torch march that the Nazis did and that the Ku Klux Klan did. And they were chanting, "First stop Charlottesville, last stop Auschwitz." They were also chanting, "Jews will not replace us." Okay? Not everybody who is involved in wanting to not see history denuded, thinking that for all the flaws that people had, be they Thomas Jefferson, be they Robert E. Lee, that when we remove our history, we run the risk of repeating those things, right? That's not these people. These people have a hatred specifically for the Jews, right? It turns out that in the weeks and months leading up to the Charlottesville event, on one of the servers that these people frequented, they were talking about how to run people down with cars, right? And that's exactly what ends up happening there, and there's several more incidences since that time of those things happening. And again, we need to be really, really careful here not to grab the paintbrush out of the Democrats' hand and then paint everybody with that brush. But that's what the Democrats are doing. They're saying that if you voted for Trump, you're a racist. And frankly, they feel there is no place on the planet for you. Words like that lead to action, unfortunately. So when we look at how anti-Semitism has presented itself over the years, we talked a little bit about the blood libels, about how there were these stories about how the Jews were stealing children, sucking their blood, doing horrible rituals with them, all to Satan. And on the basis of that, things like the Spanish Inquisition begin and continue for hundreds of years. This hatred of the Jews, tied to the blood libels, tied to the idea that the Jews are this separate community that keeps to themselves, and that by the very nature of the fact that they're careful with their resources, because they have to be, and because even in this time frame, they are God's chosen people, and He does bless them, and they prosper. They are deemed to be this cabal that is controlling the puppet strings of the world and causing all the horrible things in the world to happen. Today we have people who point at, on the left, who point at complaints against George Soros, who actually that's a very valid complaint. He has destabilized countries specifically and made much profit off of it. You can look at that history, right? But that's not the same thing as saying an individual versus all Jews everywhere are part of this cabal. You have this cultic thinking that begins, and these people talk to themselves. They end up isolating from their families. They have had a large flux of people come out of the QAnon groups now, because all of these predictions that they were saying were going to happen didn't happen. And as they're talking to these people, they're finding that they became alienated from their friends and their families who did not agree with them. The QAnon group was set up to be a Gnostic-like structure. Oh, we got the special knowledge for you. The rest of everybody else doesn't happen. You wait. Here comes the day. Here comes the activity. This is going to happen on this date. Mark my words. Only when the day comes and goes, nothing has happened. We saw those things rampant in the last couple months since the election. And I will just tell you, I don't know if there's truly truth to it. There are suggestions that some of this was ops by the Russians. But if you wanted to instill stupidness into people, this would be one of the ways to do it. To get them to buy into something that is not going to happen and then to act upon these things. And there are some articles having to do with how the groupthink comes into play in that. But groupthink specifically, and I've got a web link up here that I would encourage people to look at. Psychology of the individual and psychology of the group are two different things. On an individual basis, you use logic, you use causality. All of those things become important in how you evaluate the world around you. Unfortunately, there is also the psychology of groups. And in the psychology of groups, all of that disappears. There is no logic. It doesn't matter what you say. And if you think about conversations that you have had with, pick your dividing group, but people on the other side from where you think, you can probably very quickly remember that the conversation goes like this. There's this fact, and the response is, yeah, but what about blah, blah, blah? There's no taking of these things and actually saying, you know, that's a good point. We probably shouldn't allow our side to do those things either, or whatever, right? There's just the support of the group to the point of almost rabid belief in things. And this is hard, but it leads people to be in a place to where there is no ability to talk. I literally have had conversations with people who told me that since I was white and male, that I could not in any form or fashion contribute or understand the racial issues in this country. Think about that. If you want to change things and make them different, and if you say that the people on the other side, that there's no talking to you, there's no reaching you, there's no ability to reach a middle ground, what other recourse is there but violence? And now you have self-justified your violence by saying, I already knew you weren't going to get it. If you'd have gotten it, you'd have just done X, Y, Z. But that's what we're dealing with. Groupthink is terrible. QAnon specifically has had 16 major predictions since 2017, and every single one of those major predictions has been wrong. Okay, these people are not of God. They may claim that they're of God, but I will tell you that if they are using God's name to validate their prediction, Deuteronomy chapter 18 tells us specifically that if they are wrong, we know they are not of God and that they are of the devil. Hard, right? The difference between what it is that we want to happen, and that's where groupthink comes in, versus what actually will happen, right? This anti-Semitism is within this group as well. And again, it's like it's sprinkled into portions of it like pepper or salt. It's not everybody in that group, but there are people within that group that are holding those positions and acting upon them. Same thing with the Proud Boys, right? You would think, well, how could the Proud Boys be racist? The guy who's in charge of it is half black and half Puerto Rican, or Puerto Rican, half black and something else, right? How can he be racist? The reality is that racism comes in all kinds of forms, and I'm not saying that he is, but others in that group, clearly, if they can stand up and wear a shirt that says 6 million dead Jews wasn't enough, they clearly are. And we have to be very careful and considerate about where we put our time, what things that we're looking into, and how it is that we are going to conduct ourselves as representatives of Yeshua HaMashiach. Because associating with those sorts of things are not appropriate, ever. This is from a quote from November of 2013 in an article called Statism, Whether Fascist or Communist, It's the Deadly Opposition of Capitalism by Harry Binswanger, and this was in Forbes magazine. And he writes, a government that taxes 40% or more of our income, that controls our medical care, that regulates businesses so thoroughly that every firm large enough to afford it has a department of compliance, a government that controls the money supply, sets bank reserve ratios, regulates stock offerings, and margin ratios, and by the way, you can now add into that they're getting their fingers in the midst of the GameStop issue, right? Because heaven forbid their folks, the ones that have bet for GameStop to go under and have options to go short, heaven forbid that their folks should lose money, because that's their buddies. Those are the folks that are coming into the Biden administration. Home construction, they control, determine what pharmaceuticals and medical innovations can be sold. Oh, by the way, we're not going to let you do ivermectin, even though it seems to work really, 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 really well, and it's dirt cheap, because we don't want to repurpose a drug that is an older drug. We would rather expend resources to find something else that's new that's going to work. And we want you all to get the vaccine, and more importantly, be it masks, be it shutdown, be it medications, we want you to do what we tell you to do because we know better than you, and we know better than the scientists. They want to raise the science banner. Let's do that. Let's look at those studies and let's see how many people have died unnecessarily due to the science that they have put out that they didn't quite have right. They operate schools and universities. They run the passenger rail system. They forbid offensive speech. They're increasingly intervening in diet. Well, let's go there for a second, right? They literally have been killing people since the 60s. And they knew it, and they did nothing about it. And they've been fighting tooth and nail the scientific literature that shows clearly that loading everybody up with carbohydrates leads to heart disease, leads to arteriosclerosis, leads to blood pressure issues, leads to obesity, leads to diabetes, leads to cancer. Let's just go down the list of maladies that we experience as a modern society, and they're tied to insulin resistance due to carbohydrate intake. Oh, but let's go and increase the amount of carbohydrates and let's decrease the fats because we tell you so, because we know better. Because we're the smart folks. They're subsidizing agriculture and now into green businesses. They're deciding which businesses win and lose. They're imposing tariffs. Who can merge? And now we know that they have been spying on their own citizens at the lower levels and even at the higher levels. And by the way, you can expect that given all this stuff that's in the airways about how homegrown terrorism is the big worry, just like it was at the beginning of the Obama administration, they will be turning further the power of the government against you and me. Because they may not like what I'm saying tonight, or they may not like what I say on a cell phone, or text, or email, because they have access to all of that. And be really clear, it would never cross my mind at this time to pick up anything to go against our government. Assuming that the only violence that's been done to the Constitution is the violence that was done on January 6th, then those people need to go to jail. End of story. But if we find out that the violence that's been done to the Constitution occurred in the voting box, there are some other people who need to go to jail as well. And we will just see how all of that turns out. And I hope and I pray that they do the forensic audits and they find out that everything was just fine. Because I'd much rather live in a world where people are not nefariously countering other people's votes, and the only stupidness is the stupidness that comes when people decide on basis of hating their government, hating other people, that they're going to break into the Capitol and seek to do harm to the people that have been elected, whether they're people that I would have elected or whether they're people I wouldn't have elected. They shouldn't do it. So a government that would do all of these things is not remotely consistent with capitalism. And really, that's where we are at in the end of January of 2021. And the question is going to be, are we ever going to be able to bring our government back to one that our founding fathers actually conceived of? One in which we don't have lifelong politicians. One in which people who step into the process of serving, to serve their fellow man, to serve their constituents, do so for a period and return to their primary vocation that actually makes a living for them? Or are we going to continue down this line where you get a group of people and they figure out how to control things, how to manipulate things, and now we're laying the seeds of equity of outcome? There will never, ever, ever be equity of outcome right? There will never truly be, as our president said here, equity or equality of opportunity, right? Because there's so many variables there. There is not one of us who is perfect to achieve perfectly that state. Christ was the only one who could and did. But that's not in the game plan. They are holding accountable a standard that they can't even reach for what they want to do, because they're picking and choosing who wins and who loses. They're going to pick who can hold office and who can't. They're going to pick who can hold a job and who can't. Take them at their words. And those are the words that were spoken in the 1930s by the Nazis as they were rising to power, as they blackballed people who they didn't agree with, as they consolidated power, as they moved people into political concentration camps and made sure that they couldn't take care of their families. I hope and pray that we are not entering into those times again, but everybody needs to listen to what's being said and listen to it in the historical content. They didn't pull the idea of re-education camps just out of thin air. Those are historical concepts, and they are floating them as balloons that they want to then perpetrate on everybody else. Our Democratic friends, I pray that they come to their senses. I pray that they take a moment to actually think about what they're doing, rather than to step in and to further shift things so that they can consolidate their power. And once they do that, they will remove the other party. You can almost count on it. And whether they do that by the manipulating a ballot box, or whether they do that by manipulating the stand between the states, 1860, same thing over again. You push the states too far, and you will have civil war on your hands. And nobody is looking to bring back slavery or anything like that. But if you are telling people that they can't vote or that they don't have the rights that everybody else has, you are going to foment violence. And the further you push that, the more you consolidate your power, the worse it's going to get. You will create the very thing that you're afraid of, some sort of violent response to the power grab that is occurring within our country at this time. So I do hope they rethink it. All right. Hello. Tonight's message was a hard message. There's a lot of places that message will sit poorly. It sits poorly from the standpoint of looking as to what it is that the world is likely going to be doing, and what our neighbors and our leaders in this world may be doing here in the next months to years. They've generally been pretty upfront about their goals. They've been upfront. The very beginning of the Obama administration, they identified people who had sworn oaths to the Constitution, people who were former law enforcement, people who were former military, people who were Christians. And the Obama administration in 2008 made a statement that they weren't worried about Islamic militants. They were worried about those individuals and those groups. And then they set about going after them. Well, we're in a time frame where statements being made by the Biden administration mirror some of those statements that were made in the Obama administration. And we will have to see just exactly how this plays out. But I will tell you that when people tell you that they're going to do things, when people tell you these are the people that we are afraid of, when they tell you that they no longer feel that they should have the right to work, that they should have the right to participate, we may very well be in trouble. And again, it's my prayer that our Democratic friends will come to their senses. But history doesn't bode well. We also have a hard message for those of us who have listened to these statements that have come out of groups that have literally led people astray as to what their expectations should be. We literally had people that were making statements that there was going to be some sort of magical solution by which President Trump was going to be able to still maintain office. He was going to invoke the National Guard. He was going to invoke the Emergency Act. We had all these informations that were being put out and picked up. And I would tell you that it's very much like the bearded darnels, the tares. The damage that has been done from the repeating of these statements with our neighbors, with people we work with, people who before, when we came to share the gospel with them, said, well, you seem like an upstanding person. I think maybe I should listen to you. But now, with the repeated lies that have been stated, right, it will absolutely impact our ability to reach people. It will bring up the hand that says, don't talk to me. And that's hard. Our hearts for the Lord and our desire to see the works of the Lord progress and continue, there's not one of us who doesn't want that to come. There's not one of us that isn't looking forward to that day when our Lord and Savior returns. But have we taken ourselves out of the ability to do that work? Hard to say. The good news, as always, is that we have one who knows our shortcomings, knows our foibles, knows where we're going to stumble, and he's not one who turns his back on us, but he's one who bends down, puts an arm around us, and lifts us gently at the elbow to bring us up back into fellowship with him. And now it's going to be a faith act. What are you going to do? Are you going to have faith that he who made the universe can find forgiveness and can continue your works that he has prepared for you before the foundations of the earth were laid? Or are you going to say, you know, what I've done is so bad and my God is so little that he cannot make this right? I don't know about you, but I know who I serve and who I have placed my trust in. And I hope and trust and pray that that God, who is the God of the universe, is the God in which you trust as well. When the children of Abraham were brought together, God instructed Moses to tell Aaron. I always find that interesting, that there's this movement down the line, to give this blessing to the children of Israel whenever they are gathered, so that the name of the Lord would be upon them. And how we need that name upon us now. How we need to walk in the righteousness that is the righteousness of Christ. How we need to step forward boldly to continue the work of the gospel, to continue the works that God has laid before us. Yivorekeka Adonai vishmereka, Yair Adonai panavaleka vikuneka, Yisa Adonai panavaleka viasim lecha Shalom. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance towards you and give you his peace, the peace that comes from the Shar Shalom, the peace that is not a peace the world can understand. It is a peace that he has given to each and every one of his children. Bask in it, walk in it, speak in it, and spread that peace to all the world as you make converts to those that would know and love the Lord. Amen. Bless, and we will see you tomorrow at Midrash U at 8:30 and for Shabbat at 10:17. Shalom.